Greetings, everyone. Thank you for everyone who's joined already. We're going to give it until about 5 past to give everybody a chance to come on in. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Okay, here's the program that you've all seen already. While we're waiting and getting started, we're going to put up a quick little Mentimeter poll. I hope most of you know how to use it so far, but you can see the instructions on the screen just now. Please use your phone or another window in on your computers. It'll come up just now. Just to answer one quick question on Mentimeter. There we go.
2889 7028.
For participants to come in.
Two 889 7028.
Yes, who aren't used to Mentimeter, literally just type into your browser www.menti.com, and then it asks you for a code, which is up there. And then the question is, in your experience, does inclusive data lead or follow data users? So what is the relationship between researchers and data users? Do we push our users, our policymakers, or do we follow them? If you're a policymaker or a data user, do you generally find that your researchers push you, or do they follow you? Okay. Let's give it one more minute. We've got 27 people on the call. That's lovely. Let's see if we can get to 30 and then we'll start. All right. Welcome, everyone, to the 4th and final session of our seminar series on queering social survey research. The seminar series is the brainchild of Stembiso, who is our host. Thank you very much with the GCRO, and then we have other organizations co-hosting. I think most of you have probably received all of the emails. We're not going to go into all of that detail, but we do just want to appreciate that this has been an incredibly useful exercise over 3 sessions already, and now a 4th one. And we are going to, after this session, be producing a provocation, a write-up of the inputs received and the discussions. And so we do very much encourage all of you to keep watching out on emails for the continuation of this conversation. And we also do ask you to comment and make questions on the chat, which is always available to you during the course of the presentations. Before I introduce the speakers, I just wanted to ask Naledi to give us a short house rules introduction, please.
Okay, thank you, Tara. Welcome, everyone. Firstly, would like to let you know that the session is being recorded to facilitate the reporting process. Okay, So please ensure that your microphone is on mute unless you are unmuted by the chair to participate in the discussion. Please use the chat box to write your questions or comments to the speakers. If you would like to contribute to the discussion, please click on the participants icon and select raise hand, which will alert the chair that you would like to make a point. Please share your name and affiliation after the host has unmuted your microphone. Please select lower hand once you have spoken and your microphone will be muted. Finally, we would like to note that while the conversation today may touch on aspects of queer lives and identities which will be sensitive and personal, we will do our very best to create a safe and welcoming space. We invite you to co-create the space, and let's also remember that queer lives can be lives of joy and celebration too. Now I'll hand over to Tara, who will take you through today's session. Thank you.
Thank you, my lady. Much appreciated. So today's session brings us to a point in our conversation where we've already discussed why is this important? Why is a more diverse and inclusive understanding of gender identity, sexual orientation, an important part of moving the social justice agenda and also the very practical operational needs of social research forward. Getting beyond the dichotomy, basically, which is still the standard question in large-scale surveys. Why do we need that? We then had a conversation about the different actual experiences of researchers in trying to formulate questions that capture a more inclusive and diverse understanding of these concepts. And what we wanted to come to now today is, well, what do we do with this data once it has been generated? And what are the relationships with the data users, the policymakers, the donors, the implementing agencies that then have to take decisions? And it's not as we all know, it's not a linear process where your researchers decide on something, create some data, spit it out, the decision makers then go away and use it or decide not to use it. It's a circular process. So your researchers design their work based on what questions are posed and are posable in a particular context, how the implementation challenge is defined in the first place, and what they think will actually be acceptable. You don't want to get kicked out of a country because you're asking difficult questions, or you don't want to not get your ethics approval, or you don't want to not be hired by that donor and by that implementing agency ever again. So there are very particular practical constraints from a researcher perspective, but most importantly of all, of course, we have the ethical considerations related to the people affected by and participating in a data collection exercise, as well as then people who might not have had anything to do with that survey, but are still affected if there are actions and decisions taken based on a research output or based on a reaction to a debate that comes out of surveying. So what we have today is 4 fantastic speakers with an incredible amount of experience. 2 are coming out of particularly the health space. So Jennifer Power, who's our associate professor and principal research fellow at the Australian Research Centre in Sex, Health and Society in Australia. And thank you very much for being here in spite of time differences, etc. So Jennifer's research focuses on sexuality, sexual health and HIV. And she's currently coordinating the Australian National Secondary Students and Sexual Health Survey and the HIV Futures Survey, and is involved in other research related to LGBTQA+ well-being, sexual health, digital sexual health literacy, etc. She will start us off, and then Terence Beney will close at the end, who's also a health expert, public health, evaluation, international development. He has worked with international NGOs, government departments, multilateral and bilateral donors, philanthropic foundations, mainly in the kind of US PEPFAR space, technical advisor on HIV/AIDS. So he's going to be talking to us about PEPFAR jargon around key populations, which includes men who have sex with men, female sex workers, etc. So we're going to be bookended by health. In between, we're going to hear from Marcel Korth, who is the principal of Living with Dignity and Gender-Based Violence at Anglo American here in South Africa. So his experience, long-standing history in civil society and social research around urban health, gender-based violence, access to finance, etc. Marcel's current role as program manager for GBV initiatives at Anglo American mining communities basically will speak to, in that corporate space, corporate developmental space, how do we think about LGBTI-related data use? And Marcel also has a long history in M&E and teaching M&E, so also will come from that perspective. And then we bring it to education. So Likho Bottoman, who's the Director for Social Cohesion and Equity in Education at the Department of Basic Education in South Africa. He's a qualified occupational therapist, has been working for the DBE since 2008. He started out in health promotion at the DBE, but then became responsible for care and support services, learner support, learner well-being, and is now in charge of social cohesion and equity. So that gives us quite an interesting spread, a very interesting spread, health, education, and more broad development, but also looking at government, looking at major international donors, and looking at the private sector. Okay, so let's please hand it over to Jen to get started. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you. I'll share my screens because I've got some slides. Hold on. Can you see the slides now? Great. Okay. Well, thank you for this, and thank you so much for inviting me. Just listening to Tara give the overview of what you've spoken about today does leave me wishing that I'd been part of that, because these are topics that we obviously work through quite a lot. I mean, I feel like we're continually actually in my job trying to work out the best way to ask questions about gender diversity and sexuality in survey research, but also broadly sort of working out and working through the politics of that, which is sort of what I wanted to speak about today. But I did focus, I guess, a presentation going through some of my research experiences that was really focused on the question that was given to us as speakers, which I really thank the organisers for, because it's an interesting question. Can researchers put diverse or inclusive gender or sexuality categories into studies before policymakers or donors or implementing partners are ready for it? Or does research follow? Does it follow an enabling or receptive policy and practice environment? So looking at that, I kind of thought there's a number of different and interesting questions that might sit under that, including what role does research play in creating this enabling or receptive policy and practice environment? Is research in itself a form of community activism or a mechanism for influencing social change? And if so, how and why and how does that work? But also, can it be rigorous and reliable research while also being this mechanism for social change? And how does that happen? How does research lead policy and practice, and what is the process? And partly I thought I'd start to look at that question by just thinking about how research that has been done about gender and sexuality and LGBTQIA+ communities specifically helped to create this enabling or receptive policy and practice environment in ways that mean some of these issues can be adopted more broadly. So, for example, gender and sexuality is more easily and comfortably and regularly taken up in health surveys or social surveys. So that's kind of broadly what I thought I'd talk about. But with reference to some of the studies that we have run over many, many years at the centre that I work, where I work. So the Australian Research Centre in Sex, Health and Society, which we call ARCHES, is one of actually 4 HIV social research centres which have been funded in Australia since the late 1990s. They were set up to undertake social research to support HIV prevention. We've been around for a long time, but it's worth remembering that at the time, so in the 90s, funding these sorts of social research centres in public health was really quite radical. A lot of public health was very much medical, clinical, epidemiologically focused. And actually, we were deliberately funded to conduct theory-driven research that really supported enhancing understanding of things like sexual cultures, sexual practices, processes of sexual communication, just to start to look at HIV prevention in more nuanced terms. So beyond telling people to wear a condom and hoping that's what it might take, you know, we all knew it took more than that. These were sort of set up to be these nuanced social research centres that sat with community, understood community, were very much embedded in queer community specifically, and reflecting back to policymakers what was happening there and how we could translate that into really effective HIV prevention policy and action. So it meant the research that we have always done has been very much grounded in community activism, actually, and community knowledge, and really wanting to foreground lived experience, particularly people living with HIV, but also more broadly LGBTQA+ community. So to some extent, the aim of our research centre has always been to generate policy for advocacy, or policy to support, research to support policy change and practice change, and research to support advocacy, which I think means that I would be coming to, when I look at the questions posed for today's seminar, actually tonight, it's evening here, I obviously would be coming from a different place to if I was trying to work on more general health or social survey research where sexuality and gender wasn't the central focus. But I do think that this question of how gender and sexuality research and research with LGBTQA+ communities has helped to create this enabling environment is important, and a good way to think or to approach those questions. I did want to flag, and I'm happy to ask questions about this later. In Australia at the moment, we do have this debate about how to include gender and sexuality questions in our national census. And it's been going on for a while. They did some trial questions in the census, but then it was actually dumped on the minister actually decided to not go ahead with it. And I think, there's a whole heap to say about that, but I do think the important point to note is that this is always political. This is never a neutral conversation about research methods, like whether we include gender and sexuality questions, how we include gender and sexuality questions. It's never methodological or it's not a methods question. Most of the time it's also or only a political question. So I think that's the background to all of these conversations, which is why I mention it there. But I've just put on the screen here 3 of the major surveys that we've run at ARCHES over the last 20 something years. What are we looking at? 22 years, 23 years. So Writing Themselves In and Private Lives are 2 repeated cross-sectional surveys of LGBTQIA+. That's the acronym we use now. It hasn't always been the case. I can talk about that in a minute. But of queer communities essentially in Australia. So Writing Themselves In is a survey of young people that was initiated in 1998. Private Lives is the adult population that started in 2006. HIV Futures is a periodic survey of people living with HIV that started in 97, and we're up to the 10th iteration of that one now. So I was just going to talk a little bit about the impact that these surveys have had on policy and the relationship between these surveys and policy. Tara, just let me know when I'm running out of time as well, because I can talk all day. I'm a talker, so just, pull me up when needs be. So Writing Themselves In was the first ever national survey of same-sex attracted, which was the term that was used at the time, on advice from the young people who were involved in developing the survey. So it was the first survey of same-sex attracted young people in Australia, and actually one of the first in the world. And if you think at the time, when it began in 1998, it was a time really when young people still, or when people still spoke about same-sex attraction or LGBT identity among young people as a phase. Like, it just wasn't taken seriously. Young people were very much invisible in policy, in health and welfare services, and in education. So the title of this study, Writing Themselves In, literally referred to the need for same-sex attracted young people to have an opportunity to write themselves into policy and practice. So in a way, from the outset, this was about leading policy. That was the overt aim of this study. The research highlighted the vulnerability of same-sex attracted young people in Australia, and to be honest, identified really quite shocking levels of discrimination and violence that young people were experiencing at home and also at schools. So, and that finding was reiterated in the first 3 iterations of that survey, 98, and then into the early 2000s, we just sort of saw levels of discrimination, harassment, violence increasing, certainly not decreasing, even though there was other sort of shifts and policy changes relating to LGBTQA plus civil rights at the time. These surveys received a huge amount of attention in Australia and had really clear, direct and significant impacts on policy. So for example, and this is just one example of many, the Writing Themselves In study was picked up in a range of policy documents that then led directly to funding a program called Healthy Equal Youth, which has been a multi-million-dollar project that operates several programs across regional and metropolitan areas of Victoria, which is a state here in Australia. It also led to funding for a really large, again, multi-million national project looking at inclusive practice in high schools, actually primary schools and high schools. So some big projects came directly on the back of that, that piece of research, and it's also very much cited in policy in areas such as mental health, health equity, family violence, and other areas related to health and wellbeing. Private Lives is kind of the adult version of that study. It was a survey of LGBTQA plus people 18 and over, focused a lot on mental health and has had a similarly large impact in Australia on mental health service provision. So there's now a whole range of dedicated LGBTQI plus mental health services that were in place, that were put in place in direct response to these studies. So they've really had a big impact. And I think there's a few things that we can think about. Actually, sorry, I might also mention those studies continue to be funded by state and territory governments that now need those surveys because they've written their response into policy. So now they need the surveys to be able to demonstrate the impact of that policy. So there is a sort of circular impact of policy research, and then you have research in policy. So the reason I think they had this, I think there's a lot of reasons why they had this impact, but I think some of the features of these surveys were that they were, while they necessarily used convenient sampling, they weren't representative population-based surveys just because of the nature of accessing the population group. They involved really large samples. So in the last iteration of both Writing Themselves In and Private Lives, we had 6,000, more than 6,000, close to 7,000 responses for each survey, which if you bear in mind, Australia's not that big. We've got about 25 million people in our population. So surveys of 6,000 or 7,000 are quite large in this country. And part of the reason we were able to recruit such large numbers was because they had really strong backing from community. So these were surveys that community had a kind of sense of ownership of. They've been very much involved in the development, in recruitment, in promoting the survey. They were passed around networks as, you know, an opportunity for people to have a say, to be noticed, to have their voice heard. So these were activist surveys, if you like. And because the community was so involved, there was also a whole bunch of organisations that used them immediately for advocacy, so made sure they were in front of policymakers quite quickly. So that relationship between community, between activism and advocates and research was really important actually to the policy success of those studies. And I think also they had impact on policy because they had an influence on social research more broadly. So firstly, I think these particular studies showed policymakers why gender and sexuality or picking up on gender and sexual diversity has to be an important consideration in these broader health studies that were happening. So in the national health surveys, in mental health surveys, in social wellbeing surveys, quality of life surveys, health and housing, these studies were able to demonstrate that you were missing a whole group of vulnerable people if you weren't asking about gender and sexuality. And in doing this, they also introduced the language that was coming from community. So these surveys put a lot of attention, and still do. We spend a lot of time getting the language right when we ask about gender and sexuality. And it's very detailed in these surveys, much more than you would do in a mainstream survey. Happy to talk more about that later. But it did introduce the idea of asking about, lesbian, gay, bisexual, other forms of sexuality, other ways of expressing sexuality, more recently asexuality, pansexual, non-binary, trans and gender diverse, and different ways for expressing gender. It provided the language for that, and it tested that language with community and translated it into documents that spoke to issues that were prevalent and on the policy agenda. So all of these demonstrated how to ask questions about gender and sexuality in relation to pertinent policy issues, so mental health, bullying, discrimination. It was bringing the language of gender and sexuality into those. And they were critiqued as being biased, because convenient sampling is always biased by its nature. It is the people who are available to, participate. But that in itself became a platform for saying, well, then we need gender and sexuality to be asked in these national social surveys. Tara, are you turning on your camera because I'm running out of time? 3 minutes? Okay, great. I'm not going to get through everything, but I'm happy to share my slides and come back to all of this. The other thing I think these surveys did was train researchers. So there were researchers that worked on these particular surveys, had a lot of experience and understanding of asking questions about gender and sexuality, who then went to work on these big national data sets. So this is the ASHA-3, which was the Australian Study of Health and Relationships, also known as Sex in Australia. This was the first time we'd ever had a big national population-based survey that asked people about sexuality in terms of attraction, orientation, and behaviours or practices, like just breaking down sexuality. Who have you had sex with? Who are you attracted to? How do you identify? So actually thinking in nuanced terms. And that came from this experience of doing surveys with queer community. So I'm going to skip over HIV futures, because that was sort of a side point in a way about that policy relationship. I actually just wanted to make this point about a queer approach to research. I think, survey methods or positivist methodologies are often seen as this antithesis to research or to queer research, because surveys kind of aim to demonstrate the facts about the world or the facts about social life and ensure these are generalizable to the population. And queer theory, sort of in the opposite, emphasizes that reality is contingent or subjective. It's not a sort of simple set of facts that are easily knowable. And that research is never neutral. In fact, research is always political. And what we put out into the world as researchers is never going to be a neutral reflection of the world. It's actually reflecting someone's perception, someone's knowledge, someone's point of view. And actually, as researchers, we have a political responsibility to understand that, to understand the reality that we're putting out there. And that includes the language we use to talk about issues, the ways in which we reflect differences in gender and differences in sexuality. So that said, I would say, just maybe provocatively or maybe just in answer to that central question, I think research always leads in that I know we can't always politically ask what we want to ask, and it's sensitive and it's difficult. And it can undermine research and it can be problematic. But I think research is always leading by the very fact that we're putting a way of understanding people, of understanding gender and sexuality, of understanding the world out there in an authoritative document. Like that is part of constructing reality, if we're using this queer lens to make sense of it. So yes, either way, I'd say researchers and research play a role in creating that enabling or receptive environment. Thank you. Yeah. I'm happy to talk more in discussion.
Thank you, Jen, for starting us off so clearly and for bringing in the question of politics and power, which is always at the core of questions about data use and research. Thank you very much. All right, let's move on to Marcel.
Thanks, everyone. Just checking that I'm visible, audible, and all of that.
Perfect.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let me also keep track of my time here. Thanks, everyone. So as Tara said early on, I've got a background in both research and civil society, and I've landed up in the private sector. In fact, so on some level, I've worked on various sides of research of data generation and data use. In fact, that only occurred to me after I had sent you my bio, Tara, but I was actually quite involved in the very first quality of life study before the GCRO had actually been established in the city of Joburg, which I still think was quite a great piece of research. And even though the kind of questions we are discussing here today in detail weren't on our agenda back then, this is 2003, I think, but certainly the collaboration between us who were designing the research and those who were ultimately meant to use it, which was the city of Joburg, was a great learning curve. And that's kind of where I am today. Again, so I work in the private sector, but I work in mining, and I work for Anglo American, which is a diversified miner that works on critical minerals. So the minerals that are used in the climate transition that go into batteries, into solar panels, into our phones. But of course, it remains mining. And what that means is we do have very close links with the communities in which we operate. And these links obviously are not always positive in a sense that we are mining. There's great legacy that we bring, even though we do believe we are changing a lot of the ways in which we work. So in that context, if I look at LGBTQ plus matters, there's of course an internal aspect in terms of, getting data out. But I think my points focus a little bit more on broader issues that include the communities in which we operate, and that's very much of my work sits. So I was thinking, what does in my context data use actually mean? Where are the data users? And I was surprised when I was writing them down to see that there's quite a lot. Tara, you just spoke about power, and executives are a key lever in our space, frontline staff. So we are very active in health, education, and socioeconomic developments or livelihoods in our communities as part of our sustainable mining plan. So we do have active work in all of these spaces. So that means there are people acting on our behalf. Often they are NGOs or philanthropic organizations. Our own staff working with communities, of course, community members, organized labor, but also consultants who actually generate this data for us, and the implementing partners that act on our behalf. I've already mentioned them. So before I come to LGBTQ plus matters, my work, as Tara mentioned, is in gender-based violence more broadly. And gender-based violence wasn't always front of mind for mining houses or any other private sector actors, for instance. So of course the question was, okay, we know GBV is an issue, but is it an issue for us? And the only way we could convince those in power was to generate the data and to put it in front of their eyes. And that led to the creation of the work that I'm now involved with, in the business. Now that we want to make this work more inclusive and more responsive to, you know, specific groups, including LGBTQ+, or even if we speak about MSM, men having sex with men, right? So in mining, we know that, you know, there may be more men having sex with men than men who identify anything but straight, right? So of course the questions are there. Well, how do we know that's an issue for us? And again, we are confronted now with having to provide the data. At the moment, we don't have it. But I guess one of the advantages being in the private sector is that the politics around these kind of issues are perhaps a little bit less, certainly in the environment that I'm in. So in a sense that I can very easily ask for this data to be generated or to be collected through consultants that we in any case have. So getting the data into data collection tools, for instance, would be easy. And even receiving the data, you know, I think the audiences would be quite receptive. But then it, of course, leaves what do we do? And I think, sorry, you can still see and hear me?
Yes, you can.
Okay. So on some level, that's easier because the environment is less politicized, if you want to look at it that way. And that would actually enable us to really use data as an advocacy tool, to make our case, to guide investments into the right direction. Another point I wanted to make, I'm looking at my time here, is that, you know, I work in a company of about 110,000 people globally. I'm one of very few social scientists in this space. So on an everyday basis, we are having very fundamental discussions. And in some cases, the data is helpful, but in others, the data is also misread or questioned, you know, interrogated, because ultimately my audience, to a large extent, is minors, right? Is people who were trained very differently, who think very differently. So having particularly quantitative data, but that doesn't take any value away from qualitative data, having data available to actually make the case is what ultimately those who take decisions need and what becomes helpful. So if I look at the question, does inclusive data lead or follow data users? If I look again at the data users that I'm involved with, from executives to frontline staff to implementing partners, then I definitely believe that, you know, data leads us there, because that data can also be used in the training of frontline staff. So if I think of the education space, Likho will still speak later on, you know, people need to, first of all, be aware, but secondly, awareness in this space isn't enough, right? The kind of data we are talking about needs to sink in much more than awareness and much more than knowledge. So we touched in the first presentation a little bit on the mechanics, and we haven't gotten there. But how we then use that data and how we use it to our advantage, of course, becomes the next question. I'm just looking at my notes. I think that's basically what I wanted to say in terms of our own experience, Tara.
Thank you very much. You've saved us a couple of minutes, but I'm sure that the discussion
30 seconds according to my timer.
Well, the discussion will give everybody a chance to ask questions and then you can come back in. So that's absolutely wonderful. Can we then ask, thank you, Likho to come in, and I'm sure that many of the themes that have been brought up so far will be continued to be developed. One of the key themes that I really put in the chat here from Marcel is that different types of data, quantitative, representative, etc., might speak to different kinds of audiences. So particularly in mining, you've got your engineers, your accountants, right? I think in the education sector, it's a very different profile of decision makers. People come with different backgrounds. So it'll be very interesting to hear, Likho, your views and your experiences about engaging with the decision makers in your space. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tara. And I hope that you can still hear me and that you can see my shared screen.
Yes, perfect.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. So, firstly, I want to really thank my colleagues who thought that it would be important for me to be part of this discussion, because these are issues that we are dealing with in education. I mean, for us, we don't necessarily do, research for research dissemination necessarily, but what we're doing is to always just reflect on some of the responses of government in the education space and whether they still respond relevantly to the needs of children today. There is a lot of research, of course, that we use as a basis to inform practice and to inform policy decisions and to inform intervention programming in especially in the space of care and support. And we work with donor funders, we work with international organizations like the UN organizations and other development agencies from the various countries that support South Africa. And so because of that interface between ourselves and the various kinds of organizations that help us with this work, we are unfortunately under the criticism and the stringent measures that have been put in place around donor funding, so that whatever implementation we come with or that we implement is based on or has got evidence base. It's based on new emergent knowledge. And because we work in an evolving space, also, we always have to keep track of what research is telling us. And part of the reason why it's difficult at the moment for basic education is that the basic education service or system as a public service has always been heteronormative or compulsory heteronormative, and it is constructed around gender binarism. And we, over the years, in spite of the fact that there's always been effort from the external sectors to query public service as a heteronormative service or as a gender binary service, the education system in itself has always been comfortable with this simplified, I will put it in inverted commas, simplified way of looking at the public service. But increasingly, because of our interfaces, I'm saying with donor funders and academic institutions and research institutions, and how we have managed to now draw closer to civil society, we are now increasingly understanding that in our education management information systems, we're gonna have to rethink about how we collect this data and how we use this data to guide intervention programming and ensure that that data follows the people from which it has been collected. It's a fairly new space of operation, and members of the civil society sector that we work with will tell you, this is an area where we struggle the most. but there's some work that we have already started, which looks at the South African schools administration management systems, so that we begin to make suggestions to the system on how the school management system data is collected, whether it is collected for administrative purposes or for research or for information, but how it should be collected in a way that responds to the needs of diverse, sexually and gender diverse children. And these are just the slides that I wanted to share with you. I want to share with you this memo that is now problematic, which comes from one of the provincial education departments in South Africa. What you see here is an intention, Tara and colleagues, of a district, on an education district that seeks to respond to the needs of LGBTQI learners. And they want, and they're doing this work against pushback that says that we don't have those kinds of children in our system. And so here is a good intention to do the work, and here is pushback that forces policymakers to not respond. And so they find a way of saying, okay, let's prove to them that in actual fact, we do have sexually and gender diverse children in the system. And it's a fallacy to make people believe that these children are not in the system. And what do? Send out a memo that says, parents, confirm that your child is LGBT, because there are parents who are willing and who are working with their children and who want their children to receive assistance, and who are saying that, look, whoever tells you that we don't have children, we are here as parents. We want to tell them that we do have children in the education system who are at the moment discriminated and prejudiced against by the very same system. But what then happens is that as they try to do that, they then infringe on the constitutional rights, because this is not ethical. And I think whoever was doing something like this to try and guide data collection that will prove that this is a need and we need to do something about it, didn't think about the constitutionality and probably also the harmful effect that such a memo would have in the basic education system. If you send out a memo to say, identify and indicate that your child is LGBTQI, because we are under pressure as a policymaker and an implementer to make a strong case that this is something to do, we have to do this and respond to the needs of children. So you can see that there's a lot of fumbling when it comes to how ethically and constitutionally and otherwise data can be collected so that it can make evidence-based sense for policymakers and implementers. So this is what I wanted to share with you. But also I wanted to share some aspects of the gender-bread person, that one of the issues that we have to consider when we collect data and when we use this data to inform policy and practice, we've got to understand what aspects of the gender spectrum are we collecting as basic education. Because I'll tell you, gender parity is still a thing that we need to deal with, because we are in a society that is unequal, and we are driving an education system that is unequal. And we've got to ensure that the education system is turned around so that it addresses the inequalities that are embedded in the system. Now, when you collect this data, understanding that the issue of gender parity in the binary sense is still a thing, because if you look at the National Development Plan, you look at the medium-term strategic framework of the country, you look at the National Strategic Plan for Gender-Based Violence and Femicide, and all related strategic documents that we use as the state, we are still under obligation to collect data that helps us understand how far we have moved to ensure that there is gender parity in the binary gender spaces? What are we doing for girl children to ensure that they access education, they stay in education, and they achieve good results? And what are we doing to ensure that women in the space do receive the opportunities to rise up in it? So those pressures are still on the system. And in addition to that, we also have an obligation to ensure that we query the systems that we've built for ourselves, so that we're not just responding to gender binary issues, but we respond to the needs in the entirety, in the gender spectrum entirety. So that's the other thing that we have to deal with. So when we collect data for education, practice, and policy purposes, we need to agree at a very high level. What are we collecting? Are we collecting about identity? Are we collecting about expression? Are we collecting about biological sex? Are we collecting about attraction? What are we collecting? And for what purpose? Those are the things that we need to still resolve as a system and as a sector. Lastly, I want to share with you that even as we collect this data, we acknowledge that not all children are the same, and not all of them are starting at the same place. Many of them are still grappling with the whole social construction of gender as an idea. And, these are the issues that we need to be comfortable with, because in some instances, some of the children that we deal with transition within the 12 years of space. And I'm talking about, and give an example now of children who are of transgender identity. Within the 12 years of schooling, they may transition. And so what that means is that as the basic education sector, we need to gear ourselves and be ready for transitioning children, for things that change, because we know that gender evolves and it changes. And just because in grade 1 a child was a particular gender doesn't mean that in grade 7 you need to follow that child as a particular gender, or as a child who still has the same gender needs that they had when they were in primary. So these are the things that we're grappling with. And to answer the big question of the seminar today, is the data that we're collecting doing what it is supposed to do? The answer from me is no. There's a lot of work that we still need to do to ensure that the data that you collect does in fact lead to policy and practice that is credible, that is relevant, that is appropriate, that is responsive to the emergent needs, gender needs of children today. And I'm just talking about children at the moment, but I know that the same conversation goes for educators and non-teaching staff that is everywhere in our schools, grappling with the same issues in their adult life, coming with these issues all the way from school when they were still children. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. That was incredibly useful and interesting. And what I'm taking from your input is a couple of things. One, very much importantly, that you've got this distinction between intentions and actual implementation when you're trying to deal with very sensitive issues, and however positive the initiative is to try and generate data, if it's done in the wrong way, it can be very damaging. I also hear from you that there are different sources of pressure that then have an interesting, different kinds of effects on public services. So you spoke initially about working with international donors and private sector donors who have different views on the public sector. But then also that there's pressure from schools themselves, from the parents, from the learners increasingly. So different kind of internal and external pressures. And then I do think that final point that you started out with, like administrative data, is another one of those incredibly interesting areas that I wish we could have an entire seminar series on. So thank you for bringing all of those aspects up for us. Let's go to Terence to take us back into the health space and into the international and kind of continental space, where at least the examples we've had so far, Australia and South Africa, you know, are at least at a legal level accepting and understanding of these attempts. But I think you have experiences that you want to share with us that are in a very different context. Thank you, Terence.
So thank you, Tara, and thank you to the colleagues that have gone before. This is such a rich discussion, and I'm so happy to be part of it. And my approach today is, my experience is in international development and public health, HIV programming in particular across the continent of Africa. And I'm going to use a sort of, I thought, kicking off with a sort of a case study to try and grapple with these issues. But I think, I mean, I'll do the spoiler right up front. I do think that while data research is important, data really matters. It isn't, I can't agree with Jen that it takes the lead. I think it's a lot more complicated than that. But I'm gonna take us through this little sort of case study, and then you know, try and riff off my observations from the case study. I stole the title from one of my favorite books, and I do feel like working in this space, you know, I'm keenly aware of the social justice imperatives, but also I'm like I cannot be in a more privileged position in terms of my maleness, my whiteness, my gender identity, you know, and operating the space. So my lived experience is completely different from the people who are this programming serves, and so I'm keenly aware of that. And for me, my career is a moral adventure. I do feel like you know, I'm working towards not only for social justice, but also, you know, my own moral orientation in a very complicated world, I must say. But so what I wanted to, I want to take this example of work that I was involved in Tanzania. I did an evaluation of a program that delivered HIV services to what USAID, CDC, and the PEPFAR program call key and vulnerable populations. There's a lot of jargon, and it's worth thinking about that jargon too. So KVPs are key and vulnerable populations. And the HIV programming, through massive funding from the US government, the US government spends literally billions of dollars a year in Africa addressing HIV issues. It is probably the major foreign investment, or you know, programming investment that happens in the continent of Africa, and probably globally, is the amount of money the US spends in health, and particularly addressing HIV and related issues. So in Tanzania, we went in at a very difficult time to evaluate a program that operated under very hostile conditions. At the time, the government of Tanzania was ideologically very populist. It still is, I guess. And one of the targets of its populist rhetoric was the LGBTIQ community. And of course, that is a very important community in HIV programming for several reasons. In Africa and globally, you know, it's not the 80s. It's not the disease isn't primarily focused on these subpopulations at all. The main vectors of the disease are heterosexual practicing people. But however, it becomes an important vector of the disease when you start getting the epidemic under control. And that is primarily because services are not directed to these groups, right? Services are directed to the heterosexual practicing population. So, so what happens is these pockets of population become neglected, and then you haven't really affected HIV prevalence in these groups. So what I did was I took statements in this slide. I've just taken statements from the evaluation that we did, statements of findings, and then I just sort of aggregated them into a comment I want to make about what happened that we noticed in programming, for HIV in this very difficult or hostile environment. And so I put a quote on the left-hand side there, and you can see that the legal status of key and vulnerable populations in Tanzania was a big hurdle, and people were afraid to access services, afraid to report violence. And what had happened was the government had influenced the programming model. So the programming model before this sort of turn in the political environment was to have people come to service centers or within the community, and that was very attractive to the key and vulnerable populations, subpopulation, because there was less stigma. It was services that were particularly directed towards them, that were sensitive to their situations in a difficult environment. And then the government banned these service centers, community-based service centers, and said everyone, if they want services, have to go to government facilities. And so then there were a couple of things that happened. First of all, the PEPFAR-funded program, which was called SAUTI, responded very well. They responded immediately with an advocacy drive. The leadership of the program were well positioned sort of in Tanzanian elite society. So you had people who were who knew the technocrats and who knew the politicians, and they could immediately respond and start advocating and engaging with them. And I think that was very important to sort of diminish the politicization of KVP populations and programming within the sort of broader system or systemic context. And that happened immediately. So there was an immediate response about, okay, if we can't do it your way, how can we do it? The second thing that happened, and I think there was a dividend, I call it the sort of progressive dividend of the technical focus, was that because these programs are deliberately technical in nature, the social justice component is hidden in countries like Tanzania and Uganda to a large extent. It's mainly about making sure that people get services so that the epidemic gets under control. So that does, it's problematic, of course, admittedly, but there is a progressive dividend to it, in that when the case is framed in terms of controlling the epidemic, it gives it legitimacy in a very difficult environment. And so partnering with key institutions like the the Medical Research Institution, and engaging the technocrats and the technical service delivery entities creates what is the spectrum of awareness across national, regional, local level, and people become aware of LGBTQA communities, of their specific needs, of their specific identity. They become not necessarily familiar, but at least aware that the lived experience is different. And so there's a change that happens in people that are engaged in technical tasks. And then what happens with programs like this is there's a lot of system strengthening. And so the system strengthening manifests as guidelines, job aids, tools, forms, registers for data collection and so on, recording of services delivered. And this stuff gets developed often collaboratively then it gets disseminated. People get trained on it in government of Tanzania facilities. And so then as a result of that, again, people become more aware, but they also deliver an appropriate service. And then, the civil society is mobilized across the country and recruited into these programs. There's a lot of funding, and a similar thing happens. There's training, there's use of tools, there's then direct interface with LGBTQ community for people that are heteronormative and heterosexual and identify in very binary ways. But that exposure has an effect. And then the other thing that this program did, and these programs tend to do, is necessarily recruit a community cadre, a community workforce that is based in the LGBTQ community. So they're peer support people and outreach people. You have to, in these kinds of contexts, you identify and recruit beneficiaries into a program in a snowball kind of way. So you get LGBTQ folks that come in, and then they begin to build out the network and extend the services that way. And there's this volunteer workforce that becomes empowered because they get trained, they get access to other programs like income generating activities, and they benefit from this program, and they become recognizable and prominent in their broader community, not just the LGBTQ community. And they begin to take on leadership roles as activists, not just for LGBTQ issues, but community issues. And that produces a substantial empowerment dividend in these communities. And it sort of, it reduces stigma, which is very prevalent, in these places that we work. And then something interesting happened as well with when the government banned the drop-in centers, these community-based centers. The work with the formal facilities just escalated, and several of them became what was known as key population friendly treatment centers, and those care practices became embedded. And so it sort of had the opposite effect of what government had intended, which was to sort of expose and sort of reinforce discrimination. It went the other way around, and it worked the other way around. And it was as a result of, this external program that just responded so well. So when it comes to, the research and the data and so on, and whether it takes the lead in sort of, I guess, creating or driving policy. My response is that I think it's far more complex than that. First of all, I think, I'm a data scientist, I'm an evaluation person, but I'm also a programming person working on strategy and on policy. But I think that research, social surveys, evaluation in particular, data science very much so, these are very sort of technical practices. And the kind of stakes we're talking about are beyond technical practice. It takes more than just, the evidence, the data to push a social justice agenda. And data frequently just responds to the lead taken in other areas, taken by policy, taken in this example, particularly by funding, by programming, by advocacy. And so data, evidence generation is a responsive technical practice. Now, sometimes the lead is advocacy. The lead is changing policy, and someone is paying for that, and someone particularly wants that. And so you structure the generation of evidence around that goal. But that data, the data generations follows utility. What was said earlier about how do we use it? What's the purpose of the data, or what's the purpose of research? I think it is dependent on other things, and doesn't lead them. I think the other thing that we need to be very careful of, and as we saw the example in the previous presentation as well, the data ethics, we need to be vigilant about data ethics as we work in this area. In Tanzania, there was actually a lot of concern because our data is at patient record level. It's at beneficiary level. And we share this data with local institutions, as one should. But then the government's getting populist, discriminatory, and one becomes afraid of what government might do with the data if they get their hands on it. And so one has to be very vigilant about that, and how you collect it, of course. And then, I think that research is an important contributor. Evaluation is an important contributor. The generation of evidence is an important contributor to a social justice agenda. But everything else contributes to it. Acts in concert, or they fight, they contest one another. But policy, advocacy, programming, it's a political arena, and the politics lead where we go, and we can use the evidence to change the conversation or influence the conversation, but we can't. Evidence doesn't lead. I put a little thing at the bottom there on the left. I think evidence is a location of contest, and it's not contesting just with other evidence. It's part of a much bigger fight, and I think with convincing data that's really strong, really good, you make headway. But as we've seen over the last few years, people will believe anything, and quality evidence is not necessarily going to sway them. And that's my piece.
Thank you very much. Wow, so we've had 4 amazing inputs. We have 15 minutes left for a discussion. I'd love to see some hands. If there are questions in the chat, that would be fantastic. Let us know, please, if you'd like to ask questions of the panel. I'm going to kick us off by just saying that there's really 2 core interesting themes that I think have come out from all of us. I'm hoping Likho is back, because he had doesn't look like it. He had load shedding. So unfortunately he's not here. But so the 2 things that I'd really like each of the panelists to come back on, maybe with a little bit more information, until we have some other questions from the group, is the one which is this relationship between, well, actually, the relationship between the triumvirate of researchers, communities, and then sort of senior decision makers, structural, institutional decision makers. And Jen spoke to this powerfully, so did Terence. I think it was partly there in what Marcel and Likho were speaking about, so that when you have your technical researchers engaging with the community in the design, in the data collection process, and then very much in the data use process, that combination is what is incredibly powerful and has all sorts of interesting ways of engaging with the higher level institutional decision makers. And really, so that we also make sure we're thinking of the community itself, the LGBTI community, and basically broadly people affected by and involved in the data processes as data users as well. they are also a greater youth audience to be thought through right away. And then the second point that I thought was really important is administrative and technical processes. Likho spoke about this in terms of the kind of Department of Basic Education, internal school management systems. Jen spoke about this a bit, and Terence, you've spoken a lot about it. System strengthening, I think that's a fantastically interesting space that comes across as this very apolitical space, but is actually a highly transformative space if used very intentionally. And so that sometimes really radical changes can come in under the radar in system strengthening and technical and administrative processes. All right. Marcel has a hand up. Please, can I ask the speakers to just come in on those 2 points briefly, and then I'm really hoping that we have some questions from the audience. Marcel.
I was just clapping my hands actually rather than raising them, because I think the point that you make about the transformative powers, even with administrative data, is is really great. So that's what I was trying to indicate through my clapping hands.
Okay, Jen?
Oh, listen, I actually don't know if I can say it better than you just did. I mean, as far as, and I'm glad that Terence put a different view to mine in terms of where the leadership goes, because I think it's both, right? Actually, it's complicated and it's complex, and in some ways, there's a relationship between community researchers and policymakers or higher level decision makers. That's you're constantly sort of working in parallel. So research is following policy because that's how it's funded, how it happens. It's happening. Community are the ones who make research meaningful, who make it happen, who bring it in front of policymakers. Sorry, I think that's a really, really long-winded way of saying what we said before, that it's actually all political. So the point, I guess, maybe Terence, you could speak more to this. Like I kind of feel like evidence is rarely apolitical. It's rarely sort of data that, as I said in my presentation, neutrally follows policy and practice and politics, and where the community's kind of at, and where policymakers, where the country is at. Sorry, it's getting late here. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think that's an interesting point. Like, can data and evidence ever be sort of neutral? Where does it sit in that respect? But also that point of the power of administration, that's something we've spoken about a lot, even just some of the work we've done around inclusive practice in health services for LGBTQA+ people, just sort of putting forward that idea that, a triage form or an intake form is not just about collecting data, it's also about a message. What do we stand for? Who's allowed here? Who's welcome here? So even on that sort of simple level, administrative data is quite important, and it's more than collecting data. It's also actually a stance in itself, and that can be problematic, as we saw as well in terms of that school form wanting to out the students. But it's always political, I guess, is the message.
Thank you.
So,
Terence?
I mean, I totally agree with Jen in that it's always political. And I think how it is political is of interest. So obviously the politics starts with what questions you're prepared to ask, and what questions are put forth in the public space, and whether you have to fight to put together writing themselves in survey and get it funded, or whether there's a political environment that's amenable to getting something like that done. And so it starts there, and then it gets political in terms of interpretation. It gets political in terms of response. Where I think we have a leverage point as sort of data technocrats is that there are times when we handed a magic data set that is just incontrovertible. How people choose to use it is something else. There was this fabulous study that I think you can go and find it. The New York Times did some awesome graphics on it, and it was about persistent systemic racism in the United States. And what it showed is that, for example, children of Black households in the United States, Black privileged households, are far more likely to fall back into poverty than remain affluent or gain on their parents' position. And certainly that's far more true comparatively with the control group of white kids. Things like that. And this kind of data, when you can demonstrate that sort of thing, I mean, you've got a very strong evidence position, and the evidence itself then is not political, but how people use it then becomes very political. So obviously there's a whole swathe of policy geeks that will just ignore that evidence or dismiss it, but it's strong and it's incontrovertible. And then the other thing about system strengthening is, I think what PEPFAR has done, it's not an uncontroversial program, obviously. There's a lot of, there's a lot of criticism you can direct at it for its sort of, it's almost imperialist bias, it's neo-colonialist practice, because it really has impacted on Africa in positive but also negative ways. But there's something that it does, I think, for which it deserves credit, and that is that it introduces, through these system strengthening and technical interventions, it introduces progress. For example, the fact that we even count men who have sex with men in countries like Tanzania and Uganda, that's a big deal. There was a time when that was opposed. I mean, that was a fight, and that had to be, insisted upon. And then, it escalates to a place just beyond the systemic stuff as well. In Uganda, or technical rather stuff as well. In Uganda was poised to introduce a bill that recriminalized homosexuality. And although this wasn't explicit or in the press, we were all aware that it was PEPFAR that stepped up and told the government in no uncertain terms that if this bill goes forward, we withdraw the funding. And if you know anything about PEPFAR funding, that's a massive blow to a country's finances on this continent. So there's something that does happen through these programs that is progressive, even though it doesn't always appear to be.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat, which will take us to the end. So Cassandra, thank you. Posted, I wonder if there is a tension of power and politics with regards to how sexual orientation and gender identity data is distributed to the general public. It is always going to be accessible to the people with wealth and economic or social resources, which creates a disparity on long lines of wealth and class with regards to access to this kind of information. So yes, we haven't talked about class yet. So let's do a final round of talking about class and what that does to data access and decision-making processes. Can we take, Marcel, any thoughts on that?
Apologies, Tara, I was sidetracked. Please repeat the question.
So it's the question that Cassandra posted in the chat, that basically if you have SOGI data distributed to the general public, there's going to be a discrepancy of access to that information in the general public, where you have people who have more economic and social resources able to access that data and then take decisions for themselves, influence strategies and policy again. But you actually have the poorer parts of the community with less resources, social and economic resources, who don't have access to that data or are less likely to. What does that do? Hopefully I'm getting it right, Cassandra.
I mean, we spoke about readiness early on already. I'd be more concerned about, I mean, that data could also be used for detrimental outcomes, right? Or abused. Maybe I'm reading the question here, I'm looking at it, but maybe I'm not getting it in the same way that you're reading it, Tara.
Well, answer it in whatever way you think is relevant.
Yeah, I mean, again, if I give you know, a simple example from our side. So we speak about connected and unconnected employees, unfortunately. So we have a lot of mine workers who work underground that we often assume have access to the same data that we circulate to those, for instance, who have access to email. And I guess the solution is, and we haven't found a good one, because every time I ask this question, does everyone have access to this information that we are circulating? And that includes, by the way, surveys, including about employee experiences, of experiences around safe spaces, and that's crucial about, the groups of people we are talking about here today. And in my mind, all it needs is being intentional about it and making sure that the technology is set up in the way that it reaches everyone, right? Because we do have access to everyone, including those who do not have an email address, through an internal app, through SMSs. So there obviously, I mean, there will be a dynamic around, power and politics there, because what you get back, obviously, isn't necessarily representative of your whole population.
Thank you, Marcel. Terence, very briefly, 1 minute, and
Yeah.
Jen, close us off. I'm sorry that Likho isn't here, but yes, please go ahead.
So I think it's a good question. I think it's the question at the tip of an iceberg of an issue, and that is not necessarily about access to data. It's about access to information and access to knowledge. And the question is it's not just a power disparity. We generate a lot of knowledge, evidence-based knowledge that is very important for both social cohesion and policy. And the fact is, it doesn't get to people who you would want to hear it. It's an entire arm of knowledge generation and dissemination that needs to be addressed. I mean, I would say it's not just the availability of that knowledge across groups that displays this power disparity. It's the use of limited or wrong knowledge to exercise power over groups. And so it's not just about poor people don't know. It's not like that. It's rich people know and don't care. For example, I have to use this example, like the whole Liz Truss and the libertarian policy setup is ridiculous. I mean, it's long been debunked. All those policies are over. We know we have a mountain of evidence to say libertarian economic policy does not work. And yet you have powerful elites who will use that, and maybe they're ignorant too, but just unaware of knowledge and impose, systems on people that is purportedly evidence-based that is not. So I think, it's true in this area as well, but I think it's just it's a much bigger question than, Cassandra, than even how you've articulated it here.
Thank you, Terence. Likho is back. Are you able to just give us some closing thoughts?
My sincere apologies, colleagues. I had to move to other spaces now. But I just want to say thank you, colleagues, for the opportunity. And And I think just also for inciting the thinking, especially among us as policy makers and policy implementers, because, you know, I know that it sounds like it's just a webinar, it's a seminar, we did it today and it's going to be over, but it stays with us because it begins to challenge the way that we think and the way that we direct, you know, our processes and our business processes. But also it gives us hope and comfort, knowing that there are people who are working in different spaces that are complementary with what we do as a public policy practitioners, who are able to provide us with information gaps where we find ourselves wanting. And we really, really welcome inputs from colleagues. I know that my colleague Melinda Swift is already working with our South African schools administration management system to look at ways and means of making it more affirming and inclusive for our LGBTQI children in schools. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Likho. Last thoughts, Jen, and then we're going to say thanks to everyone.
Just very quickly, because I just concur with everything the other speakers have just said. Listen, on the issue of class, I think you could absolutely apply the questions that have been asked across these seminars to questions of class and how we collect data about the experience of people across different socioeconomic classes, or however we sort of define classes. I don't think that's well articulated in data. I don't think we understand well enough the different ways people are able to participate in research on class lines. And there's room for a lot more interrogation about that, particularly as it relates to sexuality and gender as well. So thank you. This was great. Very interesting seminar.
Thank you very much, everyone. So just again to close out by thanking Stembiso Mkhize, who has guided us throughout this whole journey, and it's been such a pleasure to be on this journey with you, Stembiso, as well as the colleagues Naledi and Vuyiso who've been supporting. Thank you also to Pierre Brouard from the Center for Sexualities, AIDS and Gender, who's also partnering on this program, myself from Social Impact Insights Africa, and everyone else who behind the scenes has been part of this amazing seminar series. As I said at the beginning, we are going to be writing something up and circulating that to everyone who registered to any of these sessions. So you'll be hearing from us again. And we certainly look forward to finding other ways of continuing this conversation because it's far from over. We are just starting out, and everyone and anyone who is interested in continuing the conversation with us, just get in touch, let us know, and we'll let you know what the next steps are. Thank you, everyone. There you go. More information. Thanks, Stembiso. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks so much, everybody. All the best.
Bye.